All right, this is part one of what life in a modern city, so urbanization of the Gilded Age, is about here. So this is part one. Well, part one we'll talk about this kind of top part here of what urbanization was, and the second half we'll talk about some of the problems of urban life as well as kind of what it was like in the city. Okay, so we're starting in the late 1800s here with as modern industry expands here, so kind of the beginning of the Gilded Age. We're going to go through the early 1900s as cities kind of become more used to the modernization that has been occurring. So when we talk about urbanization, we're talking about this kind of rapid expansion of cities. So, for example, New York City, their population tripled from 1860 to 1900. They went from like a million to something like 3 million people. Chicago expanded even more rapidly, right? Population went from 100,000 to a million, right? And a large part of this expansion is due to immigration. So immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like places like Italy, Greece, and Russia. These are Catholic immigrants or Greek Orthodox or Russian Jews. So these are not necessarily the people that have been coming previously, and they're oftentimes discriminated against. They tend to be poor and unskilled and young, which means they don't have a lot of money to move to other places in the country. So they settle in big cities, kind of where they arrive. And oftentimes they are settling in these ethnic neighborhoods where they're kind of like around other Italians, other Greeks, other Russians. So you have like a Little Italy neighborhood, for example, where all the stores would be all the signs would be in Italian. You hear people speaking Italian on the street. They'd be living near relatives, cousins, that sort of thing, people from the same village even. So they were settling in these ethnic neighborhoods. They were kind of like these little areas where it was kind of like transporting a piece of Italy or Greece or Russia to that neighborhood. And so that was helped to ease their transition a little bit to America, because a lot of these immigrants were used to kind of living in a rural situation, not in an urban area. So in Europe, they were in rural countryside. Now in America, they're living in an urban area. You also have a few other migrations happening. You have some Eastern farmers that are moving to the cities as well because they're struggling as farmers. And so, due to low crop prices and such, so they're moving to cities. And you start to see some African Americans, after kind of Reconstruction or after the end of the Civil War, start to move out of the South into northern cities. Though this won't really begin to be a huge move until after 1900. So as immigrants adjust to their life in the city, you have this tension between assimilation and traditional culture, right? So you have, the groups of immigrants that came from Italy or Greece or Russia or wherever to America. There's a question of how much do they assimilate and how does that happen? And oftentimes you have this conflict between first and second generation immigrants. The first generation maintains stronger ties to their original culture. They speak the language, cook the food, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the second generation, because they're exposed to other things that aren't their traditional culture, become a little bit more assimilated and become a little more Americanized. You also see this play out with gender roles too. In Europe, a lot of these countries, they have traditional gender roles where the woman is a wife and a mother and stays home and runs the house and that sort of thing. But once these immigrant women arrived, because they were poor, all these women worked outside the home, oftentimes as domestic servants and that sort of thing. But they were working outside the home. And whenever you're working outside the home, that means a little bit more independence. So there's a bit of conflict here over the traditional gender roles. And then also another factor that's driving assimilation is that public schools, where the second generation students are being educated, they taught English. So they weren't hearing necessarily their language everywhere, right? They were speaking their language at home, but then when they're in school, they're learning and being taught in English. So that's kind of adding to their assimilation. And then so you have this, and then in terms of what they eat too, the grocery stores that were happening, places like the Five and Dime, those kinds of places, the food they were selling was American food, right? Not necessarily the ethnic food. So those are all factors that are causing assimilation of immigrants. But you also have some tension with people born in America, this nativist idea, which we've talked about before. And oftentimes they blamed immigrants for urban problems. We'll talk about the urban problems in part two. But they were also afraid of job competition, right? And so much so that on the West Coast, the Chinese immigrants that helped build the railroad Congress actually passed a law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which ended immigration from China. Now, that didn't happen with any of these other groups, possibly because the Chinese, in terms of ethnicity, stood out a little bit more than the Italians, Greeks, or Russians. You had groups that developed, these nativist groups. The Immigration Restriction League, which was wanted to screen immigrants, basically get the right kind of immigrants, have literacy tests, income levels, that sort of thing. They wanted to kind of limit immigration to just kind of the top people. Whereas the American Protective Association, they were a little more radical. They want to stop immigration completely, right? So these large immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe that don't really fit into other previous groups, the reaction to that is nativism, right? So the nativist groups blame these immigrants and want less immigration, partly for economic reasons, partly for cultural reasons as well.